Have you gone mad?
Yes, I know it's madness.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. Please, if it is your first time and you like this video, have a look around at the channel and see if there's anything else you like. And this is actually a part of a series of videos I'm doing about banned or challenged books. So it's a project that was created by MJ at Reading This Life. And that project is called 24 for 24. And the idea is that we'll read 24 banned books or challenged books in 2024, and the idea is that we'll be talking about them, the reason why they were banned, and how we feel about the book as well. And talking about these books is really important, and because they should presumably be sensitive issues sometimes, certainly probably most of the time, although not too much in the first one I did the Wizard of Oz, and that wasn't particularly sensitive issues, but it would be important to talk about that on the channel as well. So I think it's a fantastic project that MJ started, and we're a few books along now when you see this on my channel, but this is the latest one I've read, and it's different from the others. It's a very specific subject matter, very specific controversy, and it's quite something I'm quite personally interested in anyway. So that was partly why I was gravitating towards it. But yeah, it's really, really fascinating book. And I'll tell you about the book. It's written by Bulgakov, who is famous as well for a book called The Master and Margarita, which I will read at some point, maybe this year. But it's The Heart of a Dog, Bulgakov. And it was written in 1924. So it was written in 1924. I want to talk about what happened in Russia and the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1924 before I go forward, because if you don't know Russian history much, then it might not be as much of a revelation that this guy, Bulgakov, wanted to write a protest against the revolution, because this is basically what this is, and that's the reason why it was banned. It's a massive outcry against what the Bolsheviks did. So, what happened? Well, Russia went through loads and loads between 1917 and 1924, and before, really. It's such a fascinating but deeply complicated situation in Russia at the start of the century and through to the revolution. There's two revolutions, but the important one is the October Revolution in 1917. But I'll tell you some of the things that happened in Russia. So they were led by a monarch at the turn of the century, and Nicholas II was his name. And in Russia, they were called Tsars, and he wasn't a particularly good monarch. Russia was in dire straits. There was hunger and starving people everywhere. It looked like he didn't give a toss, and the government decided to do an initial coup revolution to change the way Russia was being led, and that led to a more extreme revolution led by these radicals that were Marxist radicals that were kind of bubbling under in the early teens of the 1900s, and then by the time it gets to 1917, they've got a well of support, and the October Revolution happens, and they promise what then becomes known as the Soviet Union all sorts of things, but most importantly, bread and food and money and stability and all that kind of thing. They desperately needed it, and the Bolsheviks were offering that. And it's huge things happen. So the revolution is a revolution in all sorts of ways, and the person that was in charge of the revolution, Lenin, didn't actually live for very long after that. And his kind of second in command, if you like, the guy that was in charge of the sort of military side of the revolution, Trotsky, he ends up having quite an interesting life after Lenin dies as well, and Stalin takes over, and it all gets much more extreme. But it's already pretty extreme. So the Tsar's removed by the October Revolution in 1917. They withdraw from World War One. So Russia doesn't take part in World War One because of their feelings that they need to sort themselves internally because there's so much going on. There's a civil war that happens between 1917 and 1922. And that's between the Red Army, which are the Bolshevik army, and the White Army, which are counter-revolutionaries. So as soon as the revolution happens, there's a kind of an attempt at a counter-revolution, which the Bolsheviks try and stamp on. But the White Army, the ones against the Bolsheviks, are also funded and supported and physically helped by other countries as well that get involved to try and topple this communist takeover. So that civil war lasts a number of years, and other things are happening. So you get in 1918, you get the Ukraine declare independence. So they take advantage of the fact that the Tsar had been removed, and they attempt to go back to their independence status. The gulags are created in 1919, and they become quite extreme things during the Stalinist era, but they are created to deal with the counter-revolutionaries, subversives, saboteurs, people like that, for this deeply paranoid, possibly justified paranoid Bolshevik party. And you've got the new economic policy happens where Lenin tries to adapt the extreme Bolshevik trade rules that he'd created to give more opportunity to profit from trade. And then you've got the supporters of the Bolsheviks saying that he'd somehow compromised the Bolshevik ideals into some sort of capitalist thing, which wasn't the case. But you've got a new economic policy that was controversial at the time. And you've got a famine that happens in Russia between 1921 and 1923, and that's pretty serious. So that's all got to be dealt with by this new regime as well. And then when Lenin dies in 1924, he'd already written to the party and written a note. It wasn't like a huge book or anything, but he'd written a note saying he doesn't trust Stalin. He doesn't think that Stalin, because Stalin had become the secretary of the party, and because he was the secretary of the party, he had this advantage of seeing everything that was going through the party decisions and party communication and all that kind of stuff. So he had a really good advantage in knowing what everyone was doing and what everyone thought, and then manipulated it, because they didn't realize how dangerous Stalin was. Although Lenin did kind of suspect that, and he wrote a message to the party saying that he didn't think that Stalin would be able to control, but would have any self-control, and didn't trust the potential for him being leader. Kind of watch him, kind of thing. Watch Stalin, and they went. So yeah, I think that's really, really fascinating. The fact that Lenin's going, "Oi, watch him," and then he dies, and then Stalin takes over, and the country goes mental. It already was going mental, it was even more mental because Stalin was an absolute psycho. So all that's happening before this book is written. Okay, because Lenin dies in January 1924. So the fact that this is written in 1924, we know that had already happened. And I think that this is not just a protest against the Bolsheviks. I think it's also a reference to Lenin dying and Stalin taking over, and Bulgakov's fear about how he doesn't think that any good's going to come of this. It's going to get worse, kind of thing. That's the way I see that. And it's interesting as well, because at some point during the year, I'm going to be talking about Animal Farm, and that's from a different perspective. It's not someone that's in Russia. It's an English author, and it's more ideological, I think, than what this is. Although the message is a little bit more cloaked in this one, I'd say. I think 1984, Animal Farm. Did I say 1984? I meant Animal Farm. We're going to look at Animal Farm. And Animal Farm it's a little bit more obvious what the ideological points are. And there has been some debate recently with some friends about who the characters were in Animal Farm, but I'm going to put my 2 cents in about who the characters are in Animal Farm. I don't think this is specifically with characters in the book being real life characters in history like it is in Animal Farm. These are more like archetypes. So the professor who drives the plot is like the intelligentsia in Russia, the people that the Bolsheviks were trying to shift the economic power away from, to help out the proletariat, the working class. That's who the book represents. And the dog is the main character. The dog is the working class and the Bolsheviks and that kind of thing. The sort of the people who are going to get manipulated, because you could definitely say that the dog gets manipulated through the book. So sorry, I've got a dodgy cold. So the book was written in 1924, but in 1925 it was immediately banned by the Soviet Union, this new regime that I've just been talking about, and it's not released in Russia until 1987. So that's a huge period of time where it's banned, and that is because Russia changes. So perestroika happens, and I don't know if you lived through that period. I lived through that period, and it was quite shocking in the sense that nobody expected it, but Gorbachev, who was a very amiable Russian leader who kind of created ties with the rest of the world, the rest of the Western world. He created perestroika, where there was more freedoms for art and literature and dissent as well. In some ways, there was more of a discussion in the country, and basically the leadership wasn't as paranoid as it was during the kind of communist era. So perestroika brought this book into Russian hands in a more official way, because it was essentially an illegal document before that. So some people did manage to read bits of it, but it was an illegal thing for many, many years. So in 1987 you could read it. So because it was banned in its own country for so long, I thought it was an interesting one to look at, and because I'm interested in Russian history as well. So a rich and powerful professor in Moscow finds a stray dog and decides to transplant a dead man's pituitary gland and testes into the dog. That's how it kind of starts. And I'm not going to sort of talk about the whole thing. It's quite a short book, so I won't say too much about the plot. But once he does that, then obviously the dog changes, and you get this sort of hybrid between a dog and a human. And the dog starts behaving really badly, and the attempts with that the scientist is making to try and make this dog into a better creature is not working. And I'm just going to pause for a second and tell you about the fact that that's actually a real life thing. The Soviet scientists were doing experiments by messing about with body parts and putting strange body parts into humans and human body parts into animals and that kind of thing. It's very weird. So that was happening. So that's a real life thing. And he was referencing that, but using it to make a comment about the revolution. So, so this dog changes, revolutionizes through these experiments, but it goes wrong because the behavior gets worse, and it becomes this disgusting creature that's sort of upsetting the professor, making his life more difficult, and it's just not really working out very well. And the scientific experiments advance more, so you've got a brain being transplanted and a heart being transplanted, and it all kind of develops from that. And basically the dog is talking about itself, talking about how it's feeling about all that, and behaving, like being quite sort of willful in its behavior, and it's funny because the action is quite domestic in a lot of it, but it's about sort of the allegorical nature of what's happening in the book in a lot of ways through these experiments. And the dog is the first person perspective for a lot of it. There's a chapter 4 is probably the one I found most interesting, which is where the narrative device changes and their journal entries into the scientific experiments. So that there's one chapter where it's just journal entries from the professor, which is interesting. But anyway, I won't say how the plot ends, but ultimately these I will tell you that the ending, I won't tell you specifically what happens, but I will tell you that the ending is the kind of ending that I think the message from Bulgakov is that people don't seem to learn from their mistakes, and he expects the errors of in this book science, but in the real life political regimes are going to carry on, and they're just going to go round and round and round and loop. We don't learn from our mistakes. That's kind of the message, but it's a very serious and obvious and biting attack on the Bolsheviks and the revolution. And it comes from his own experience, because he was a doctor as well. This is another scientific reference. He was a doctor before he was a writer, and he was a doctor for the White Army. So before he's writing, he'd already had this anti-Bolshevik feeling, and he was working for the counter-revolutionaries as a doctor. So all these things feed into the novel. So how did I feel about the novel? It was interesting. It was good. Lots of people are calling it funny, and it says on the back that it's funny. And I think I maybe raised a smile occasionally, but I don't think I found it funny. But it is very light in its approach. So there's quite dark subject matter, quite dark things that happen in it, with all these experiments into animals. And the way it's written, it's not very what's the word? It doesn't go into too much detail about the grossness of it. So it's not gruesome, but it's definitely I didn't find it funny, but it has got this light, sort of fluffy way of, it's got an energy, a bounce to it that I think is quite attractive, and it does make it easier to read because of the sort of allegorical nature of it. I mean, if you compare it to something like 1984, 1984 hasn't got a bounce and energy to it. I think it makes it more stoic to read, whereas this is a lot more light, and the energy behind it does give it quite a unique tone, which I'm hoping will be there for the Master and Margarita. If that's the way Bulgakov writes, that'd be interesting, but we'll see. It could be that he just wanted to do it partly maybe because it's a lot of it's the perspective of a dog, and he thought that might work. I don't know, but yeah, it was interesting. I liked it. I didn't love it, but it's fascinating that it was banned for so long. One of the things I want to be talking about in these videos is, should it have been banned? Clearly, it shouldn't have been banned, because it's just a perspective on a revolution that completely transformed the country and set it on a particular course for a number of decades. So it's quite right that people should be able to protest against that. But it was a period in Russian history where there was all sorts of revolutions and counter-revolutions and threats of new changes. So I do think when you really look into it, it's not particularly shocking that the Bolshevik party was really paranoid, because they'd just done this huge thing in the country, made this massive change, and they knew there'd be reaction to it, and they had to make sure that they were able to start their policies and start this change they wanted before they get toppled back and taken out of power. So I do think that is a realistic thing that happened, but ultimately this country full of paranoia is not going to be conducive to peace, which is why revolution, that's the nature of revolution as well. And I think what I'd love to do, actually, I'm not going to do this yet, but what I'd like to do is have a look at that kind of thing and see how how revolutions have been resolved, and picking out some of the big ones. A lot of countries have had a revolution, and how that's affected the immediate future that was being created from that revolution, that kind of thing. But certainly in Russia, it created a well, I think probably because Lenin died. Lenin died, Stalin took over, and Stalin immediately started doing these quite extreme things that created state communism, and that was essentially using what Lenin and Trotsky had started, and then making it more extreme. So they had already started, like they created the gulags before Stalin was there, to react to these counter-revolutionaries and stuff. So they were reacting to this idea of clamping down on their revolution being stopped straight away, and then that ends up being a big thing that ends up being a character of the state when Stalin takes over. So it produced a particular kind of Russia for many decades until Perestroika, and Gorbachev changed it. So I do think that what the Bolsheviks did was very dramatic in a long-term way, but I think the way it happened is almost by chance, and it's almost it's very reactive, and I think that's part of the interesting thing about it. So this book is a huge protest against it, coming from a man who had worked as a doctor in the White Army, so he worked for the counter-revolutionaries, and this is him saying how essentially these political experiments were creating a distorted, disgusting, disadvantaged country. So there we go. Heart of a Dog by Bulgakov. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks a lot for watching. Keep reading banned books. Stay curious.